I cannot be a pessimist because I am still alive. If a person keeps walking, even knowing the destination might not exist, is that proof of hope or just the final defensive habit before collapse? If a society continues to function, produce, learn, have children, and plan for the future, even as predictions of climate crisis, inequality, and ideological fragmentation become increasingly clear, does that demonstrate a reasoned optimism or an instinctive collective denial? We often consider hope a fragile, vague, easily shattered, and even somewhat naive emotion. But if we ask seriously, could humanity have survived until today without some illusion of tomorrow? The book you are about to hear does not offer an empty declaration of positive thinking. Instead, it is a comprehensive exploration combining philosophical analysis, psychological data, historical patterns, and deep personal experience to answer a seemingly simple, yet profoundly unsettling question. Do we still have any reason to believe in something good, whether for ourselves or for the world? To answer that question, let's explore this book together. Part 1: Inner Optimism. I became an optimist the night my wife died. It wasn't a moment of enlightenment, nor a miraculous light shining through the darkness. It was the ultimate outcome, the strange, unexpected result of the most painful days of my life. Catherine was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer just after we lost our first child to a miscarriage. The doctor stated bluntly that the disease had metastasized and no truly viable treatment plan existed. I read every report, every medical study, and understood that her chances of surviving 2 years were almost zero. But Catherine wouldn't allow anyone to mention it. She demanded that everyone, friends, family, doctors speak only of hope, and I, her closest partner, was forced to learn to be silent about the all-too-obvious truths, to play a part alongside her, the one who believed in miracles. There were nights I found myself a machine, speaking words of comfort while thinking of a survival probability below 5%. But I still spoke, I still hoped, even though inside, that belief was bleeding out day by day. Then she passed away. No miracle, no magic, just a body ravaged from within, an unbeautiful departure with no time for a complete farewell. People told me I should live one day at a time, that time would do its work. But I felt like a ghost who had survived an accident everyone thought had killed him. I didn't want to postpone living another day. Catherine once told me, "You mustn't lose your way." And I decided not to. I began to try living many lives, becoming a city man returning to the countryside, a nomad without a fixed abode, a night owl with wine, exhibitions, and live music. I wrote blogs, one for friends, one for the world. I didn't find anything that truly made me happy, but I kept going. I didn't know why. I just knew I was moving forward. A friend asked, "Am I on medication?" No, I hadn't thought about it. I also wasn't in therapy. Someone suggested a support group for young widowers, but I had never been one to believe in collective comfort. I refused to commemorate her death or our old wedding anniversary, the first Christmas without her. I didn't want to live in the old calendar of a life that was no more. I began to doubt myself. Was I denying my emotions, or was I just cold-hearted? But I still hurt, I still cried. I just didn't think I'd stay in that sadness forever. I didn't understand why I still believed that everything would be all right. And then I realized I was an optimist. That confused me. I was a man of science, of facts, of analysis. Before Catherine's death, I thought I was optimistic because my life was good. But if, even when everything collapsed, I still held on to the belief that tomorrow could be better than today, then perhaps optimism wasn't just an emotional reaction. The problem was, I had always viewed optimism as naivety, believing in good things without evidence. But what if I didn't believe, live waiting for the worst to come? Pessimism was nothing but a weak defense mechanism. You're never disappointed because you're prepared for failure, but you also have no reason to start. I wondered, was there a rational way to believe in the future? That question led me on a journey that was not only personal, but also philosophical, sociological, and biological. I wanted to understand what optimism truly was. Where did it come from? How did it work? What good was it in a world where daily news was filled with warnings of collapse and apocalypse? Let's start with those who have overcome tragedy. In 1915, Ernest Shackleton, the polar explorer, became trapped with 27 men in the Antarctic ice. Their ship, the Endurance*, was crushed in the ice, with no radio, no supplies, no hope of rescue. They survived on seal meat, clothed in furs, and a strange belief that as long as they were alive, they still had choices. Shackleton didn't look for the toughest men. He chose those who could maintain their spirits when everything else collapsed. In a letter he wrote to his wife, "I think you would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion." For him, optimism wasn't dreaming. It was moral courage, the courage to believe that choices still existed, even if they were the very last ones. Helen Keller, blind and deaf since childhood, wrote a sentence I've never forgot. "I used to know only darkness and silence. Now I know hope and joy." A stream of water flowing over her hand, another hand spelling out the word water. That was the moment she called. My hand found a tiny word, and my heart burst open for life. Keller didn't just believe in inner optimism, a subjective trust in the future. She also believed in outward optimism, the belief that the world could become better. But her belief wasn't blind. She wrote, "We cannot hope unless we act." For her, optimism was a verb. There's a clear paradox. While figures like Shackleton or Helen Keller viewed optimism as vital for survival, modern society regards it with caution. You'll see this skepticism everywhere, in politics, science, popular culture. If a leader speaks with an optimistic tone, people will smile and call it naive, hollow, illusory. But if someone warns of collapse, their voice trams yuang, using words like existential crisis, they are immediately seen as profound. There's a key word. Pessimism is seen as a sign of intelligence, while optimism sounds like a denial of reality. But that's wrong. We have a very strange tendency. When results are good, we attribute it to optimistic vision. When we fail, we turn to blame that very optimism as the cause. So, what is true after all? To understand optimism, we need to distinguish between two things: optimism as a concept and optimism as a tool for action. And the truth is, true optimists are often the most decisive actors. Let's return to the story of two frogs falling into a bucket of milk. One struggled in panic, then exhausted itself and died. The other kept churning the water without stopping. It had no idea that milk could turn into butter, but ultimately, that unconscious action created a solid base for it to jump out and escape. The second frog didn't know what lay ahead, but it didn't give up. It's a perfect metaphor for the latent power of optimism, not because it guarantees success, but because it gives us a reason to keep trying even when we can't see a way out. But the frightening thing is that many people no longer believe they can escape. We are falling into what I call the pessimism trap, when prolonged disappointment saps our motivation to seek solutions, even when they still exist. We begin to get used to not believing in a shared future. While people still believe they personally will be fine, no one believes society can get better. That's the optimism gap. A 2019 survey by TIMAP in 27 countries showed that over 60% of young people believed their own future would be bright, but less than 40% believed their country would also have a good future. When you believe you'll do well personally, but don't believe the world will improve, you'll lose the motivation to engage in things larger than yourself. That's when individual belief disconnects from the community. That's when collective pessimism flourishes. I recall a conversation between psychologist Kenneth Clark and writer James Baldwin in 1963, amidst the height of the civil rights movement in the U.S. Baldwin had just been denied entry to a meeting with the Attorney General. His voice was tired, his gaze distant, cigarette smoke wafting in the studio. Clark asked, "Are you optimistic?" Baldwin looked straight ahead and replied, "I cannot be a pessimist because I am still alive." If you are alive, you still have the capacity to create something, and if you refuse that right, you are abandoning your very humanity. It sounds sacred, but it's more practical than we imagine. I'm not talking about vague hope, the everything will be fine kind. I'm talking about disciplined optimism, a state of mind that accepts uncertainty but does not accept powerlessness. On that journey, I discovered another strange paradox. We aren't really good at predicting the future, but our brains are very good at imagining possibilities. That very imagination, if we learn to use it correctly, can become a map for action. But to do that, we need to break free from preconceptions about so-called reality. Let's go back to a story I'm very fond of about baby chicks. Swedish scientists conducted a simple experiment. They taught chicks to associate colors with food. If white cards always yielded worms and black cards were always empty, when given a gray card, the optimistic chicks would run towards it. Chicks, seemingly simple creatures, possess the ability to infer positive possibilities when faced with ambiguous signals. Not just chicks, but mice, dogs, dolphins, even bees tend to act more optimistically when raised in stable, rewarding environments. However, if they live in environments with electric shocks, deprivation, or around stressed individuals, their behavior changes, becoming pessimistic and defensive. That's not religious faith or a philosophical concept. That is biology, an evolutionary reflex. We, as humans, are creatures whose history of survival is built on taking risks, exploring, and stepping out of our comfort zones. But when we lose the feeling that we can influence outcomes, we retreat. We choose to stay in the cave instead of venturing out for food, and then we starve to death right within that safe zone. Imagine you're a mouse, you're hungry, but if you crawl out of your nest to find food, you might collapse from exhaustion or be caught by a cat. If you don't go out, you'll also starve. So should you go or stay? It's a question without complete data. You don't know if the cat will appear today, nor if there are plenty of seeds out there, or if other mice have already cleared them out. Every decision carries risk. Under such uncertain conditions, the brain needs a default bias to make a decision. And that bias, in most species, including humans, is to act if there's still a chance. That is an optimistic choice. This is the basis of error management theory. In conditions of lacking information, making a mistake in a positive direction is still better than making one in a negative direction. If you mistakenly think there's food and go out, at worst you'll be tired. But if you mistakenly think there's nothing and don't go out, you might miss a chance to survive. Optimism, in this case, isn't an illusion, but a survival strategy. And then we discover that humans have a special kind of illusion called positive illusion. Since 1980, psychologist Neil Weinstein conducted a classic experiment. He asked hundreds of young people how high they thought their chances were of being in an accident, getting cancer, or divorcing. And almost all of them answered lower than the average. It wasn't that they had better data, they simply saw themselves as different. Everyone thought they were less likely to be unemployed than others, less likely to get sick, live longer, be more successful. And they didn't realize that if everyone thought that, then clearly someone was mistaken. Researchers then continued to test hundreds of variations and discovered that the vast majority of us live with expectations better than reality. Even stranger, even when reminded, we still don't adjust too much. Psychology calls this the optimism bias. It exists in 80% of the population. Only 10% are realistic, and the remaining 10% are pessimists, often those suffering from depression. Why does the brain trick us? The answer might lie here, because it works. Studies show that optimists tend to have better health, fewer infections, stronger immune systems, fewer heart attacks, recover faster after surgery, and live longer. They also tend to have wider social networks, higher incomes, and lower divorce rates. The reason might not just be because they see life through rose-tinted glasses, but because that very belief leads them to act in ways that help them achieve better results. Someone who thinks they will be healthy will exercise, eat moderately, and have regular checkups. Someone who thinks their career will progress will actively learn new skills, apply for jobs, and be more persistent after an initial failure. In other words, positive expectations increase the probability of positive outcomes. There's an experiment I found particularly interesting. A group of people was asked to write down, "What good things do I think will happen to me in the next 5 years?" Afterwards, their brain activity was measured, and what appeared on the brain scan was that they imagined the future exactly as they recalled the past. The brain doesn't clearly distinguish between, "I have done that," and "I will do that." Imagining a good future can create real positive emotions, just like recalling a happy memory. And that emotion, if strong enough, will trigger behavior. That's the foundation for the best possible self technique. Write about the best version of yourself, living the life you desire, having achieved what you hoped for. When you do that consistently enough, your brain will start to believe it can happen, and you will act in that direction. However, not everyone readily accepts that idea. Those with a pessimistic explanatory style, meaning when they fail, attribute it to their own incompetence, believe the fault is permanent and will occur in all areas, finding it difficult to escape a negative psychological loop. In contrast, Optimists will explain failure in a temporary, external, and specific way. They think, I failed this time because I was tired today. I'll do better another day. That helps them try again, while pessimists don't. That's why insurance salespeople, whose job involves daily rejection, have a higher success rate if they have an optimistic explanatory style. They are more persistent, better at enduring failure, and don't collapse after each failed call. And that's why cognitive style, not just ability, can determine success or failure. As a child, I always believed I would accomplish something great. I didn't know what it was, just a vague feeling, a bright shadow in the distance far enough not to be clear, but close enough to keep me moving forward. Many people carry that feeling. They can't explain why they think their lives will be all right eventually, but they just believe it. It's not based on data, not because their parents are rich, not because they're prettier or smarter than anyone, but simply because that belief is like a small fire from within. That is the first form of optimism, ontological optimism. From a neuroscience perspective, this makes sense. The human brain dedicates a very large part to the ability to imagine, not just dreaming, but simulating the future. The prefrontal cortex allows us to plan, imagine scenarios, and predict consequences. But what's surprising is that this part of the brain is most active not when we worry, but when we hope. When you think of a better version of yourself, your brain begins to activate regions that control motivation, memory, and emotion, as if you've already test-lived that future. And if you test-live it enough times, your brain starts to see it as a real possibility. We, with all our rationality, are actually very easily fooled by our own imagination. But instead of seeing that as a weakness, I think it's a gift. There's something strange I realized. Most people who have had the strongest influence on the world possess extraordinary imagination and a hard-to-define type of optimism. They aren't always cheerful people, nor do they always think positively. Many of them, from Steve Jobs to Nelson Mandela, suffered from depression, were rebels, were outcast. But they had one unwavering thing: they believed that things could be different, and they acted as if it would happen. Call it a realistic idealist or practical idealism. He knew not everything would succeed, but he still demanded things no one else dared to imagine. He envisioned a beautiful, user-friendly computer while the rest of the world was still tinkering with circuit boards and green-red screens. He imagined a future and began to behave as if it already existed. That wasn't wishful thinking, it was a form of directed action. We often think we need to wait for proof before believing, but history changes when someone believes first, then creates the evidence. When Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream," he didn't have any social surveys showing that dream would come true. He only had an imagination and a community that imagined it with him. A dream isn't just something to sound good. If nurtured enough, it can become a behavioral compass. And when many people dream the same dream, the world begins to change. There's a term I really like: possibility. It doesn't mean it has a probability of happening, but rather that it can asterisk happen if we create the right conditions. Optimism isn't saying good things asterisk will asterisk definitely come. It's saying good things can asterisk come if I act as if it can. A psychologist once asked children, if you think you can become a scientist, what would you do? And what if you think you can't? The answer was very simple. If they believed it was possible, the child would start reading books, asking more questions, looking for experiments. If they thought it wasn't possible, they wouldn't do anything. The perception of possibility makes all the difference. But there's something else I find more important. Optimism isn't just about what we believe about the future, it also shapes how we understand ourselves. If I believe I have the ability to change my circumstances, I will behave differently from someone who believes they are a victim of circumstances. This is the root of a profound concept: agency. Many people live as if they are watching their own lives from the audience seats. They observe, analyze, complain, sometimes applaud or boo, but they don't step onto the stage. I was like that after Catherine died. I sat in one place, watching other people's lives online, reading news, keeping a diary, but not truly living. I was the writer, but no longer the main character. It was when I started to step out of the observer role that I began to revive, and I realized that the belief I could rewrite my own life story was the deepest form of optimism. I began to understand that optimism doesn't come naturally. It's not a genetic gift, not a privilege of those born lucky. It's a skill, like playing an instrument, like writing, like loving. It needs practice, trial and error, persistence, and like any skill, it begins with the awareness that one can learn it. When I was little, I used to be afraid of the dark. Not because I thought there were monsters, but because I couldn't see anything at all. But then, when a small lamp was turned on in the corner of the room, I wasn't scared anymore. Not because the light chased away all the monsters, but because I could see. There was nothing there. Optimism is that small light. It doesn't banish all dangers, but it helps us see more clearly, and when we see clearly, we can decide what to do next. There's an experiment that kept me thinking. Researchers divided participants into two groups. One group was trained in optimistic habits. Each day, they wrote down 3 good things that happened and why they happened. The other group did nothing. 6 months later, the journaling group had significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, lower rates of depression, higher ability to cope with stress, and they even started achieving better results at work. This isn't magic, it's just repetition. When you continuously pay attention to the good, you start training your cognitive filter. You gradually see opportunities your brain previously overlooked. This is an effect called the reticular activating system. It decides what is important for the brain to process. If you tell your brain that good things are important, it will find them. If you tell it that life is full of danger, it will find evidence for that. The brain doesn't seek truth, it seeks what you tell it is true. That's another reason why I believe optimism shouldn't be seen as unrealistic. In fact, it can be the most realistic if understood correctly, because reality isn't something objective that stands outside of us. Reality is what we perceive through the lens of our personal history, current emotions, and what we hope for. When I say I believe I will overcome the pain of losing my wife, I'm not denying the truth that I've lost her. I'm just choosing how to survive with that truth. And when I say I believe the world can be better, I'm not naive. I just refuse to believe that everything is predetermined. You might call it selective ignorance. I call it mental resilience. In an era where skepticism is highly valued, where news constantly reminds you that everything is getting worse, maintaining a positive belief is an act of defiance. It's not easy. Sometimes it makes you feel isolated, seen as unrealistic, pushed out of mainstream conversation. But I don't feel sad about that. Because I know that if none of us believe tomorrow can be better, no one will dare to start anything. Inner optimism isn't a rejection of reality, but a new kind of relationship with reality. It's the ability to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed. It's the ability to act even without a guarantee of success. It's the ability to feel joy even while still suffering. We don't need to optimistically rationalize everything, but we need to learn to keep a space open for good things that could happen. Because otherwise, we are locking the door to our future before it even has a chance to knock. I survived tragedy not because I'm stronger than anyone else, but because even without clear evidence, I chose to believe I would keep living. That's the starting point, and also where every story of change begins. Part 2, Outward Optimism. I used to think this world couldn't change. Not because I was cynical, but because I was once a journalist, someone who lived by the news, immersed in a stream of misinformation, disappointment, betrayal, and breakdown. Every day, thousands of headlines poured in: war, climate crisis, social injustice, political fraud, humanitarian disasters. With every refresh, I saw a new reason to think nothing would get better. Once, I looked at the midnight news and wondered why we still woke up every morning. It seemed like everyone knew this ship was heading for an iceberg, but no one was willing to turn the wheel, or worse, the wheel was already broken. At such times, I began to understand why many people chose pessimism. They weren't weak, they were just exhausted from hoping. But then something strange happened. As I sat with the stories I had written and the people I had interviewed, I realized something. The most profound changes never come from the majority. They come from a few who believe. Even if the rest don't believe, they don't need the whole world to agree. They just need to be persistent enough, resilient enough, stubborn enough not to stop. And they are the ones who make the impossible a reality. I began to look at history not as a cold sequence of events, but as a map of the seemingly impossible. There was once a time when people believed slavery was the natural order, that men had the right to beat their wives, that illness was divine punishment, that airplanes were absurd, that the internet was a fleeting fad. Every major turning point in history was once ridiculed, scorned, dismissed. Every changing idea was once an anomaly, and strangely, almost all the advancements we live with today, from antibiotics to women's suffrage, are the result of strategic optimism. I call that strategic optimism. It's not vague hope. It's a calculated choice, believing the world can be better and acting as if it's possible. There's a common mistake. People think optimism means believing that things will naturally get better. But history doesn't show that at all. Progress isn't an automatic trend, it's the result of organized effort. And without action, without people daring to imagine a different world, the default will be stagnation and, worse, regression. A bright future isn't a reward, it's a product. We are living in a time when it's especially hard to believe that. We've become accustomed to empty promises. Too many leaders call for innovation, greener, better, but do very little or nothing. People gradually become indifferent to slogans because they know they are just stories constructed to buy silence. And so they abandon the belief that anyone can change the system. Pessimism becomes armor. It helps them not to expect, and if they don't expect, they won't be disappointed. But that's a trap. When no one believes in change anymore, those in power don't need to change anything. When no one imagines a better world, the worst actors will, by default, write the script. And I think that's the most dangerous thing, not the badness itself, but the acceptance of that badness as destiny. Once I asked an environmental activist, "Do you think we will win the fight against climate change?" She looked at me, no smile, no hesitation. "No," she said, "but I don't think I need to believe we'll win to fight." That was a new kind of optimism I had never considered, not because success is guaranteed, but because inaction is unacceptable. A kind of moral optimism that doesn't rely on probability, but on principle. Because if you know something is right, you do it regardless of the outcome. There's something surprising about history. Most of the greatest reforms were driven by people with no power at all. Beyond the belief that things could be different, women who weren't allowed to go to school but still fought to teach each other to read. Black people who weren't allowed into restaurants but still sat stubbornly at lunch counters. Workers who had no voting rights but still organized mass strikes. They had no reason to believe they would win, yet they still acted. What impressed me most wasn't their courage, but their imagination. Because to act for a world that doesn't yet exist, you must first envision it. People often think imagination is for children or artists, but I think imagination is a political tool. It's a way to escape the unimaginability of the present. Let's take an example. For centuries, society believed that social status was fixed. If you were born poor, you would die poor. If you were a slave, you would always be a slave. If you were a woman, your role was only to bear children and obey. That wasn't just external imposition, but also a limitation in people's minds. Many people didn't rebel, didn't resist, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't imagine a different world. Imagination is the prerequisite for every revolution. And precisely for that reason, those in power always seek to control the imagination of others. They use propaganda, education, religion, culture to engrave the idea that things have always been this way. It cannot be changed. Accept it. I once spoke with a citizen in a totalitarian country. He whispered, "We don't think about change, not because of fear, but because we think change wouldn't make any difference." That is internalized pessimism, a state where powerlessness is absorbed like air, and optimism, even as a vague idea, becomes a threat. In that context, optimism becomes a political act, not the superficial, everything will be fine, kind of positive thinking, but a form of optimism that dares to acknowledge a reality full of injustice, yet still does not abandon the vision of something better. This is what I learned from real activists. They don't think positively in a naive way. They live amidst violence, inequality, and suffering. But they still write, still speak out, still hope. Not because they are naive, but because they refuse to let the present become the permanent future. A Black activist once said, "Optimism isn't believing you will win, but refusing to let your enemy dictate your mood." When you maintain hope, you maintain your humanity. When you can imagine something different, you retain the power of choice. This is what puzzles me. Why, in a century where we have so many conveniences, so much progress, so much freedom compared to our ancestors, have we become more pessimistic? Partly, it's because the speed of information exposes us to global suffering too quickly, too frequently. We no longer have time to digest, to understand, to put things into context. Just opening our phones, we see the world on fire. Another part is that collective trust has eroded. We no longer believe in systems as before, not in government, not in the press, not in corporations, and sometimes not even in each other. In that space, pessimism is no longer a choice. It becomes the default. But that doesn't mean optimism is dead. I started seeing it return in small communities, grassroots movements, self-organizing groups, artists, and educators who are teaching children to dream again. They don't wait for systems, they don't wait for leaders, they don't need an election or a new law. They just start from where they stand, and they are creating spaces of possibility. I remember a group of parents in London. They lived in a heavily polluted area where children suffered from asthma en masse. They petitioned but were ignored, so they built their own air sensors, collected data, and trained their children to talk to the press. A year later, the city council had to publish the data and change street planning. That wasn't a miracle, it was optimism in action. So outward optimism isn't the belief that someone else will do something, but the recognition that you are a part of this world and thus capable of shaping it, even if in a very small way. We don't need to be certain of success, only certain that if we don't act, bad things will continue to happen. And that's reason enough to start. There's a phrase I often hear in intellectual circles: I'm not pessimistic, I'm just realistic. At first, it sounds very logical. Who wouldn't want to see life through realistic eyes? Who wants to live in an illusion? But then I started to ask, which reality is this reality? Whose reality? Based on what information? Narrated by whom? When people say that their reality is what they're doing, it's not an objective description but a framing. They choose a version of the world, often the gloomiest one, and declare that to be the truth. And I realized that sometimes, what is called realism isn't courage, but a form of educated resignation. If history only moved in a straight line, perhaps realism would be the only way. But history doesn't move in a straight line. It branches, twists, turns, sometimes sliding into chaos. But sometimes, just a small group taking action can push things onto an entirely new trajectory. The problem is people only recognize turning points after they've happened. People only call someone visionary after their ideas succeed. Before that, they're eccentrics. Therefore, if we cling to the current reality as the ultimate limit, we will never create a new reality. I'm not saying we should ignore reality. I'm saying reality is the foundation, not the ceiling. It's a place to start, not a place to stop. Imagination isn't a rejection of reality, it's a counterargument. And in a world where everyone complains but few dare to dream big, imagining something different, even if it sounds crazy, is a moral act. I once worked in the tech industry where the keyword future was repeated hundreds of times a day. But what I realized is that many visions of the future were actually just upgraded versions of the present, faster, cheaper, smoother, but not fundamentally different. But true turning points don't come from improvements, they come from flipping the question. What if we don't need to work 5 days a week? What if hospitals aren't just places we go when we're sick? What if schools aren't based on grades, but on fostering curiosity? These are questions that cannot be answered by data, only by imagination. And only when we dare to ask such questions can we open other doors. Once I attended a workshop on urban futures. Experts, engineers, urban planners presented all kinds of models: smart cities, electric vehicles, green buildings, sanitation robots. Everyone nodded along. Then, a young student stood up and asked, "Why do all the designs show the poor being pushed to the outskirts?" The room fell silent. That simple question pierced through the entire optimistic vision they were building. Because it highlighted that if imagination doesn't include equity, then it's just technology painted with new colors. And I learned something: not all imagination is optimistic. Only when it includes the vulnerable is it truly hope. I once interviewed an Indigenous activist in Australia. She said, "We don't want to be integrated into your future. We want to be invited to rewrite that future." Collective optimism isn't a commodity to be sold. It's a dialogue where everyone has the right to contribute words. And for that dialogue to happen, we must dare to dismantle current structures, dare to re-ask questions we thought were settled. What is good? Good for whom? Decided by whom? Someone might ask, so what, after all, should we believe in? I don't have a single answer, but I have a principle. If a future cannot be imagined for the vulnerable, then it is not a future at all. I don't need a perfect world. I just need a world where everyone has the ability to imagine something better for themselves and is supported in making it a reality. And that, for me, is the simplest definition of optimism. It's not certainty, not comfort, but the space for good things to happen if we are patient and brave enough. Optimism, then, isn't about seeing everything in rosy colors, but daring to look straight at the gray and still keep painting. At a dinner party, I asked a scientist, "Do you think we will overcome the climate crisis?" He shook his head, poured more wine, and said, "No, but I still continue my research because I don't know what else to do." That answer, raw and honest, haunted me for months, not because it was too despairing, but because it was too normal. I began to realize that most intelligent, well-informed people, sensitive to social issues, were falling into a kind of psychological exhaustion. They knew too much about what was wrong but no longer had the energy to imagine what was right. They had seen the system break down too many times to still believe in the possibility of repair. They weren't weak, they were just tired. And fatigue, when accumulated over a long time, leads to a kind of paralysis. Intellect was still there, conscience was still there, but motivation had vanished. Pessimism, in that case, doesn't come from a lack of understanding, but from too much understanding. The more one knows about history, about cycles of failure, about times when hope was betrayed, the harder it is to believe that something will truly change. That's why young people are often more optimistic than older people. Not because they are naive, but because they haven't been disappointed too many times. They still have the feeling that what they do can create results. Meanwhile, experienced individuals are more easily drawn towards skepticism. They know what usually happens, and that very knowledge, thought to be a weapon, becomes shackles. But there's a question worth pondering. If history is truly a repeating cycle of injustice and breakdown, then why are we still here? Why are there still people going to school, working, writing books, falling in love, having children, planting trees, curing diseases? Is there perhaps a force that cannot be measured, cannot be proven, but is strong enough to push the world forward, little by little? I call that force active belief. It doesn't come from evidence, but from a kind of moral choice. I choose to believe because if I don't, I won't be able to act. I don't believe in blind optimism. I know history is full of tragedies. I know progress is uneven, unfair. I know there are people who die in despair, even after trying their whole lives. But I also know no one ever changed the world because they thought they were certain to win. They changed the world because they thought they couldn't sit still. And that small fire, that stubborn determination that, "I will not be silent," is the beginning of every turning point. Today, many people say that humanity has reached its end, that we don't deserve to exist, that this planet would be better without humans. That is a form of absolute pessimism, not just about politics or culture, but about human nature itself. I don't blame them. It's easy to see bad things, easy to judge, easy to condemn. But I also see other things. People giving public refrigerators in poor neighborhoods, elderly teachers reading books to orphans, groups of young people cleaning up beaches, a young man installing a water filtration system for a remote village. No one forced them, no one paid them, no one recognized them. And I think if humans can do things like that, then we shouldn't give up yet. I once asked a Syrian refugee, "What do you think about your country?" He said, "I don't know, but I still keep the keys to my old house." Even though that house might be destroyed, even though he might never return, that physically useless key was an object full of hope. It was proof that there was something worth remembering and something worth returning to. We are the same. We need keys like that, even if we don't know which door they will open. Outward optimism isn't a certainty about the future. It's a kind of readiness. I don't know what will happen, but if something good happens, I want to be there. That's why I continue to write, why I talk, why I still walk into rooms where people discuss change, even if everyone is skeptical. Not because I think I'll witness a miracle, but because I don't want to be on the sidelines if it happens. Once I visited a coastal town that had just experienced its worst flood in 50 years. The water had receded, houses collapsed, roads deformed. But in the small community hall where residents were taking shelter, there was singing. A group of young people stood in a circle, singing an old folk song. The chorus resonated as if someone was calling the light back. I asked a young girl, "Do you still believe in anything?" She looked at me, her hair wet, clothes stained with mud, and replied, I believe our singing isn't in vain. And I thought that was the most perfect definition of optimism I had ever heard. We often think we need a perfect plan to have the right to hope, must know the next step, must be sure that efforts will yield results. But if we wait for enough data, enough certainty, enough rationality, we will never begin to be optimistic. In this sense, it doesn't demand us to believe that everything will be good. It only demands that we don't extinguish that possibility before it has a chance to exist. Because if we don't dare to step forward, nothing good can come near. I once heard a feminist activist say, "I don't fight because I'm sure to win. I fight so that if one day my daughter asks what I did when things happened, I'll have an optimistic answer." Then it's not an emotion, but a responsibility. It doesn't necessarily make us feel comfortable. Sometimes it even makes us more tired because it forces us not to give up. But precisely because of that, it's more valuable than any easy hope. I don't think everyone has to be optimistic all the time. There are days I believe in nothing at all. There are nights I lie awake, reading the news and feeling that all efforts are meaningless. But I always return to one question. If I don't believe in something good, then what am I creating conditions for? And I don't want to be the one to leave room for darkness to take over. In ancient Hebrew, there's a term called tikkun olam, meaning repairing the world. It doesn't mean you have to save the entire planet, but that you are entrusted with a part of the world to care for, to preserve, to improve. Perhaps it's the home you live in, the neighborhood you reside in, the children you raise, the work you do. Your part, however small, is real. And if each person repairs their part, the world can be pieced back together. My part is these stories. I tell them not because I think I have the answers. I tell them to you because I think too many people haven't dared to ask the important question, can something better happen? And if it can, what do we need to do to make it possible? That's not a problem to be solved, but a call to action. I once saw a boy draw a spaceship flying through a starry sky on a wall. Below it, he scrawled the words, "The future doesn't have to be like the present." I feel like I've lived another lifetime just to read that line. Because if there's one idea worth preserving, it's that the future doesn't have to be like the present. And if no one else dares to believe it, I will be the one who remains. Part 3. Optimism in action. There's a big difference between believing and acting. You can believe that everything will eventually be good and still do nothing, like sitting on the sofa, thinking about a healthy body, then opening a third bag of chips. Or believing that climate change is humanity's biggest threat, then still flying 4 times a month. Belief that isn't transformed into behavior is a dry seed. So where does true optimism begin? I think it begins with the question, what do you do with your hope? This is what I learned from those doing the most difficult work. Frontline healthcare workers, anti-oppression activists, teachers in slums, engineers working in places the government has forgotten. They aren't optimistic because everything is good. They are optimistic because they need to do something. And if they don't believe in the possibility of change, they can't bear it. They aren't dreamers. They are committed optimists. For them, it's the only way not to go mad in a world that constantly makes you want to give up. So the question isn't, do you have hope? The question is, what behavior does your hope lead you to? If it makes you wait, avoid, or delegate, that's not hope. That's procrastination coated in sugar. But if it makes you clean the kitchen before guests arrive, write a bill even knowing it will be rejected, or practice a skill no one asked for, then that is true hope. True hope is repeated behavior without guarantee. I once met a man who repaired bicycles in a small town. Every morning, he would bring his tools to the town square and wait for people who needed repairs. I asked, "What if no one comes?" He smiled. "I still go because if I don't go, then certainly no one will come." That's optimism in the real world. Not because you know the outcome for sure, but because you act as if good possibilities are approaching and you don't want to miss them. Many people ask me, do you have a concrete plan for change? Honestly, no. I don't think everyone needs to become a leader, an inventor, or an activist. But I think everyone has a sphere of influence where small actions can create a ripple effect. That could be the dinner table, a classroom, an email, a social media post, a kind gesture to a delivery person, a word that makes someone change how they think about themselves. Optimism in the world is when you behave as if your actions have value, even if no one sees them. A social activist told me, "I don't think I'll live to see the day the law is passed. But I still write every word because I know someone will read it, someone will continue to write." This is a form of optimism that doesn't need reward, doesn't need recognition, doesn't need perfection. It just needs presence. I call that legacy optimism. You sow a seed not to harvest the fruit yourself, but so others know that trees can be grown. So how do you cultivate that? In the remainder, I will share principles and tools, perspectives that help you not just keep hope, but transform it into meaningful behavior, not theory, but practice in every email, every decision, in how you raise your children, choosing a job, spending money, voting, loving someone. Because true optimism doesn't lie in feeling, it lies in habit. And if we change our habits, we change the world. When you look at the world, what's the first thing you see? Do you see trash on the sidewalk or a tree growing through a crack? Do you see a chaotic crowd or people awkwardly trying to understand each other? I'm not asking to judge. I'm asking for you to realize the way you see the world is the way you act in it. And every action, however small, is a vote for the kind of future you want to live in. Let's start with the simplest thing, how you tell stories. I'm not talking about writing books or making movies. I'm talking about how you tell stories to yourself, about the world, about others. Who do you say you are? A victim of circumstance or someone learning to overcome? What do you think society is? A decaying mess or an incomplete collective experiment? The language you use is the story you live by. Pessimists think everything is bad, and they're just a speck of dust in that spinning wheel. Optimists don't think the opposite. They just think if they're a speck of dust, at least they can choose how to fall. Once I spoke with a young woman who had just graduated and started working at a nonprofit organization. Low salary, high pressure, unclear results. I asked, "How long do you plan to do this job?" She said, "I don't know, but I know if I quit, the voice of my community will become a little softer. And if everyone quits, maybe no one will speak at all anymore." She wasn't deluding herself. She positioned herself as a single note in a very long symphony. And that's a kind of mature optimism. I used to think optimism was an individual quality. Now I understand it's an ecosystem. No one can maintain hope alone for too long. You need an environment. You need someone to remind you that things can be different. You need someone who has taken a step so you can believe you can too. That's why stories of survival, recovery, and rising up have a strange power. Not because they inspire, but because they are living proof of possibility. We don't need people promising miracles. We just need to see someone who was once in the dark and still found a way out. So if you want to practice optimism, start by being that person for others. Not an inspiring person, just someone who doesn't turn off the light, who is still standing there, still doing what's right, still writing a blog, still teaching children, still believing in kindness, even if no one notices. Optimism doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be persistent. I once saw a small cafe in a poor neighborhood with a sign, "Suspended coffee. If you don't have enough money, just tell the staff." It wasn't a charity campaign, no need for PR. Just a simple act, but it told a different story. One can live without watching each other, without exploiting each other, without being suspicious. Each gesture like that is a piece of a new world, small but real. And then if many people tell such stories, we can change structures. Imagine if the education system didn't just test knowledge, but taught how to cultivate hope. If cities were designed not just to optimize traffic, but to create connection. If policies weren't based on fear, but on the ability to foster optimism. If accumulated, it will gradually change standards, and standards, once changed, will give birth to new designs. That's why I believe every optimistic action is political. You teach a child to believe they can excel in school, you're breaking prejudice. You pay a fair wage to the delivery person, you are rewriting the economic model. You keep your word in a meeting, you are resetting the level of expectation in the community. Each of these gestures, if repeated, will create a new climate for behavior. Optimism doesn't change the world with a single shout. It does it with endurance. During my many years in journalism, I had the opportunity to interact with all kinds of organizations. Government bodies, corporations, schools, research institutes, staff, charities. What astonished me wasn't their budget or power, but the atmosphere they created. There were places that made you believe anything was possible. Even the smallest idea, the most eccentric initiative, was listened to, acknowledged, tested. There were other places, 10 times richer, 100 times larger, but they made you feel, don't dream anymore. Everything had already been decided from the top down, and it was best to stay silent to keep your position. I call that the optimism oxygen index of a system. Where oxygen is low, ideas die young. Where oxygen is high, behaviors thrive. Systems are not neutral. They either nurture or suffocate the capacity for hope. You walk into a school. If teachers are encouraged to try new methods, students are asked for their opinions, mistakes are seen as learning opportunities, then you see vitality. But if every action requires permission, every mistake is punished, every achievement is measured by a scoreboard, then no matter how beautiful the slogans on the walls, you still feel suffocated. To build an optimistic society, we must start by redesigning the space for hope to breathe. I once attended a meeting at a ministerial-level agency. The topic was administrative reform. A young specialist proposed a system to help citizens complete procedures faster. She prepared thoroughly, clear data, reasonable solution. The whole room was silent. Then the department head spoke up. High political risk, shouldn't risk it. The girl nodded, packed up her computer early. A year later, she resigned and went to work for a tech startup. The system lost nothing, but one person who once dared to dream. In contrast, I once visited a startup specializing in community healthcare. They had a rule: everyone had to propose an idea each month. Regardless of feasibility, ideas were discussed openly, and no one was criticized for being silly. Some became products, some didn't, but no one was afraid to think big. The result? They launched new products 5 times faster than competitors in the same industry and had an employee retention rate far above the industry standard. An ecosystem designed to accommodate optimism will naturally generate innovative energy. That's why I believe system design is one of the highest forms of optimism. You can't force anyone to hope, but you can create structures where hope can survive. That requires us to abandon the idea that everything must optimize profit, minimize risk, and continuously grow. Instead, we need to ask, does this structure allow people to believe that good things can happen? If the answer is no, then soon those who still have faith will leave. Look at the city you live in. Do the streets have space for pedestrians? Do schools allow time for students to rest, play, dream? Do organizations provide a place to try and fail without punishment? Every design, from working hours to performance evaluations, carries a message. What are you expected to be? How far are you allowed to dream? How far are you allowed to believe? There are places that only allow people to live to survive. There are places that allow people to live to create. And the distance between these two places is the distance between collective pessimism and collective optimism. To achieve that, we don't need to wait for the government, don't need billion-dollar budgets. We just need to start with small units. Classrooms, companies, friend groups, families, wherever someone dares to say, let's try it, instead of be careful. That is where group optimism exists. And if there are enough such places, we will have a different culture, where optimism isn't seen as naivety, but as a responsibility. Sometimes I'm asked, how do you maintain hope when things keep getting worse? The answer is, you don't hold hope like an object. You train it like a muscle. If you don't work it, it atrophies. If you overdo it, it tears. But if just enough, it becomes strong. Just like muscles, hope needs recovery. You can't run indefinitely without rest. Sometimes you have to lie down, turn off your phone, turn off the voices in your head, and just breathe. Hope doesn't come from seeing the light. It comes from continuing to walk even when you see nothing at all. And like muscles, hope cannot grow in a toxic environment. If every day you are surrounded by negative news, bitter words, toxic comparisons, then even if you want to hope, you'll be exhausted before you start. Choose carefully who you listen to, choose carefully what you read, choose carefully the language you use. Because every word you say, to yourself or to others, can either nurture or kill hope. This isn't positive thinking advice. I don't believe in denying reality. I just believe in choosing a fulcrum amidst the chaos. You can choose any set of facts to shape your worldview. You can choose that humanity is self-destructing, or you can choose, this is a time when we need each other more than ever. Both are true. It's up to you which branch you choose. Optimism isn't self-deception. It's choosing the data that nourishes you. And sometimes, to maintain optimism, you need to learn to let go. Let go of unsuitable expectations, let go of ideal archetypes, let go of the idea that everything must succeed to be worthwhile. Because some efforts will bear no fruit, some hopes will be betrayed, some paths will lead to dead ends. But that doesn't make them meaningless. Remember the old story. Someone sowed seeds, watered them, cared for them, then had a crop failure. Outsiders would call it a waste, but if no one sowed, every season would be empty. The sower doesn't sow because they are certain of a good harvest. They sow because if they don't sow, there's nothing left to wait for. That is the most fundamental optimism, acting as if good things can happen, even without any guarantees. Throughout the sorrowful years after losing my wife, I had no plan. I only had one small habit. Every morning, I wrote down one thing I still believed. Some days I just wrote, I believe I will breathe through today. Some days I wrote, I believe the neighbor's cat will visit again. Some days I wrote, I believe that one day this sorrow will change color. Writing it down didn't make the pain disappear, but it gave me the feeling that I was standing on the side with a door. And then one day, I found myself truly walking through that door. Now, when people ask me if I truly believe in the future, I don't answer immediately. I take a breath, I look at the person asking, and I think about what they've overcome to still be standing there, to still be asking that question. Then I say, I believe in the capacity of humans when they haven't given up on each other. And that reason, if it lives in me, can be ignited in others. At the end of a workshop I attended in Oslo, someone asked me, if you had to describe optimism with a single action, what would it be? I didn't hesitate. I said, teach. Not because I am a teacher, but because every act of teaching, whether it's teaching children to tie their shoelaces or teaching someone to read, is a way of investing in what hasn't happened yet. It's believing that there's a future where this knowledge will be useful. It's entrusting others with a part of a better world. You cannot teach if you do not believe. Or conversely, if you teach, then you have already believed. Amidst chaos, you can still hold onto a sliver of belief and live by it. I don't know what you are facing. Perhaps loss, disappointment, illness, despair, or simply an unnamed confusion amidst this turbulent era. I don't have the answers for you. I just have one reminder: you are not alone. Because if you have ever loved, you have been optimistic. If you have ever done something without being sure it would be reciprocated, you have been optimistic. If you have ever gotten up after a fall without anyone to help you, you have been optimistic. And if you're still reading this, perhaps you still have a little flame that hasn't gone out. That's where it begins. It doesn't need to be big, doesn't need to be bright, just not extinguished. Hold it like one shelters a small fire in the wind, cupped in your hands. Fuel it with habit. And when others come near, share a little light, because optimism, in the end, isn't an emotion. It's a flame passed from hand to hand. I used to think the world would change if I told stories well enough. Now I'm not sure. I just know I still tell stories. Not because I believe what I write will change everything, but because if I don't write, I won't be able to change myself. And if I can change myself, maybe, just maybe, someone else somewhere will also begin. These are my final stories, but if I've done it right, perhaps a new dialogue is beginning within you. If so, carry that flame, step outside, and don't forget the bright side still remains.